11 we already finished. This is the aggregate planning chapter on aggregate planning. It's not going to be included. Only 3 chapters, yes. Right? On Moodle, yes, I had put chapter 11, 13. That's what we had decided earlier, but they changed everybody together. Yeah, I've updated that information on Moodle already. So in Moodle, if you go, you'll see that there's only 3 chapters now. So that's just a quick information about what's coming up. Do you have any other questions or anything before we get started with this chapter? Comments, any questions? Everything okay? All right. So yes, Madhavi, next week we will have the revision. Okay, we will. So again, it will be mostly driven by you, like any thing that is, you want me to go over again. We will do that. I'll give you a quick review of what you need to focus on, and then it should be driven by you. Any other questions? Those of you who are online? We'll talk about it next week when we do the review, Madhavi. Okay, Shaima, no problem. Just remind me towards the end for the attendance if any of you came in late, and we will get that sorted out. So let me get the lights here.
Yes.
All right, everyone. That's online. Do you have any other questions before we get started with the chapter 15? Okay. So this is the last chapter that we're going to be covering. This is looking at some concepts related to supply chain management. You already have some idea about what supply chains are now. And we're just going to look at a couple of dimensions that might be a little bit important, and just to get you thinking along that line. So from this chapter, we are not going to be covering all of chapter 15. For the assessment, we are going to be we want you to focus mostly on the first 5 sections. Okay. And that's what's going to be included in the final assessment. So what is a supply chain? What do you understand from what a supply chain is? We have been talking about it from the beginning, I think, right? Many times.
Like who provide us raw material?
Okay, so suppliers, the companies that you might be dealing with. So that's part of your supply chain. So supply chain, when you talk about supply chain, we are looking at actually all the companies that might be involved in getting a product or service to you as an end consumer, right? So that's the very broad definition of supply chain, and we will see, a couple of different ways to look at it as well. And so in this chapter, mainly what we're going to be looking at is, we'll look at what supply chain is in a little bit more detail, and then, a big part of supply chain is logistics. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll look at what do we mean by supply chain management? What are we managing actually, right? And we'll look at an example of supply chain and some of the trends and risks associated with supply chain, especially today when supply chains are becoming much more global, right? If for a particular product to be made available, it's very likely that you get parts and materials from companies across the globe to make that happen. So what are some of the risks associated with it, and some of the ethical dimensions related to supply chain. So this is what we want to focus today. So for those of you who are online, we are going to make it full screen here. So please use the raise hand or your voice so that you can get our attention if you have any comments or questions. So, like I mentioned, supply chain, very broad definition of supply chain is all the companies that might be involved in getting a product to the end consumer, starting all the way from where the raw materials are sourced, right? So this is the very broad definition of supply chain. So it's a sequence of organizations. It might include all the different facilities and different functional areas if they are separated. Um, when we looked at an organization as a company, and we said an organization is nothing but a system that takes in some inputs and then transforms it into their products or services that they are providing. So same concept, but you're looking at it beyond one organization's limit, looking at other organizational parts as well. So all the different activities that are involved in value addition to that raw material until that becomes a final product. So this is basically very broad definition of supply chain. And today, if you are talking about competition between, let's say, Apple and Samsung, it's not just between the two companies that the competition happens. It's not between companies. More than that, it is how well their supply chains are designed and managed that will make a bigger impact in terms of whether that company or whether that product is going to be more successful than another product. Right? So the competition today is, you could say, is between supply chains rather than individual companies. And a big part of supply chain is logistics. So logistics is that part of the supply chain which is involved in moving products and storing them, and moving information, sometimes even money. Um, so companies like DHL, FedEx, there's a company here called Agility, if you're familiar. These are all logistics companies, and what they do is they move things for other companies. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate company who's doing it, but it's very likely that it will be a separate company, and they're called third-party logistics company because it's not the supplier, it's not the manufacturer who's buying the product. It's a different company. It's a third company that is moving the products for them. So logistics is a big part of supply chain, but it's only one part of supply chain. That's right. That's not supply chain. You could say is a much more broader way to look at the entire value chain, and logistics is one part of that that's involved in movement of these goods, services, information, money, and so on. So just to look at a quick example of what a supply chain might look like. So when you go and fill gas in gasoline in your car at a gas station, it's not just how well that gas station is working, or how well they're doing, that will have an impact on whether you are going to be able to get the gas on time at the correct price and at the correct quality and so on. There's a lot of other companies that might be involved in it. Right? So all the way from companies that are involved in exploration of oil, production of oil, like KOC, for example. This is what they do, right? They produce oil, crude oil. That oil needs to be transported. There are other companies that are involved in it, like, for example, KOTC. If you're familiar with, all these, they're all part of the K companies. That ships the oil to other places, other countries, or other refineries, and so on. There are companies that is trading that product, companies that are involved in refining the crude oil into the products that you would need for your car and airplanes and so on. Right? So KNPC is probably right here. Right? That's what they do. They are involved in refining the crude oil into its very different derivatives products. And those products may be shipped through pipelines and other shipping methods. It may be stored. There may be companies involved in storing it. There may be companies involved in shipping those, like the third-party logistics companies that we talked about. So here, if you have noticed, you know, when you're fueling, when you go to gas station, sometimes you'll see these big tankers bringing in, refilling the fuel in the gas station, right? If you notice that, do you know what is the company? Have you read the name? Next time you see a truck like that refueling, look at the name on the truck. It's most of them is done by Agility. This is a third logistics company here. Agility. So, yeah, sometimes, but they do a lot of that, right? So it's very likely that you will see one of the trucks that's by Agility. So this is a logistics company. They do it for these companies, other companies, right? So they are part of supply chain, and of course the retail, where you're filling up the gas station, that's the retail store. That product may also be sold in other industrial markets for other purposes, for airline fuels and for other commercial purposes as well. So that's all of these companies are part of the supply chain of that gasoline, right? So if you want to get gasoline at a certain price, at a certain quality, and it's available when you need it, all of these companies have to work together well. Only then you're going to have that product at the right time you need it. So that's what we mean by supply chain. Another way to look at this supply chain would be a simpler way to look at supply chain would be to look at what are the kind of companies that are involved. So usually there is some manufacturer who's manufacturing the product. So let's say if you're talking about a physical product, that product needs to be distributed. Usually the factory do not sell the product directly to the end consumer, right? They might send it to a distributor. Distributor might have might send it to a retailer, a retail store where you would go and buy the product as a final customer. So that's part of supply chain, but also other companies that the factory, for example, might be dealing with in getting the parts for that product, right? So if you're Apple, for example, uh, they deal with several suppliers to get the different parts that needs to go on the iPhones, right? And those suppliers may have other suppliers who are providing other parts that goes into their particular part that they're making, and so on. So you may have multiple layers, but it's a simpler way to look at what supply chain um, might look like. So even though we call it as a supply chain today, it's rather than looks like a chain, rather than like a chain, it is more like a network of suppliers, or supply. You could say it's like a supply chain network rather than just a supply chain. Why is that? What do you think? It is more like a network rather than a straight chain like that. If you're a manufacturer, are you going to have only one supplier? Probably you're going to have many suppliers, hundreds of suppliers. So if Apple, for example, they have 300 plus, direct suppliers for their iPhones, right? And those suppliers may have multiple other suppliers. Similarly, on the distribution side as well, whoever's manufacturing it, they don't distribute to just one distributor. They may have multiple distributors across different regions and many suppliers as well, right? So that's why it's more of a network but the name supply chain, this is what we have been using since a long time, and it's a simpler way to look at it. So the name, is stuck with us. But today, it's more of a supply network rather than a supply chain, um, and it's much more complex. So the operations management, we said operations management is about one company. So it's about one company. Let's say if you're looking at a manufacturer, it is looking at, okay, what are the inputs that goes into that company and what are the products that they make and how the transformation happens in that firm. But if you go a little bit broader, you can, a broader view of operations would be to look at the entire supply chain of that particular product and see how value is added at each of these different locations. So how much value is added by the raw material provider, how much value is added by the next level supplier, how much value is added by a manufacturer, how much value is added by the distributor, and so on. Um, so sometimes you can even hear people talk about supply chain as value chain. And sometimes it's even referred to as demand chain, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So if you look at supply chain of a manufacturing company or of physical products, compare that with the supply chain of services or a company that's providing services, uh, which one is going to be longer? Which one is going to be more complex? The one with manufacturing for the products, the supply chain is usually much more complex and larger than supply chain of service-based organizations, because sure, because there are usually more processes involved, and they are broken up in much more detail for products than for services. So typically, supply chain of manufacturing or physical products are much more complex, much more larger, longer than supply chain of services. And if you look at what kind of organizations may be part of supply chain, you have all sorts of facilities that could be part of supply chain. So it could be like factories, part of supply chain. It may be just warehouses where things are just being stored. Companies, if there are companies that is doing that for you, processing centers, distribution centers, retail stores, of course, would be part of the supply chain. Sometimes even offices are also considered as part of the supply chain. So, in a supply chain, you could have many kinds of facilities, right? Not just factories, it's not just companies, but all kinds of companies could be part of your supply chain. And as we mentioned before, sometimes you look at supply chain, and some people refer to it as value chain. And the idea is that each company adds certain value to the product. Uh, so a gallon of crude oil may not be as expensive as a gallon of refined, petroleum, right? So how much value is added by the refinery taking that crude oil into a refined product, and so on. So each company that's involved in your supply chain is expected to add some value, and this is one way to try to understand how you can, part of managing supply chain would be to try to see how value is added, and try to bring that cost down by removing non-value added links in that chain. So supply chain sometimes people also differentiate between supply chain and demand chain, and they are referring to supply chain in general, but specifically, so if you go here, for example, we can So if you're a manufacturer, let's say if you're a factory, then your demand chain, your supply chain would be this part of your supply chain, your overall supply chain, right? The companies that you deal with as suppliers and their suppliers and so on. So sometimes you will hear people differentiating between supply chain and demand chain. And the main idea here is when you're talking about supply chain, from that point of view, you're looking at the supply side of your operations, of your company, right? Or your suppliers and their suppliers and so on. And for, again, many large companies, it makes sense to look at that in different ways because this might be longer in some cases than this part of the supply chain. And this part of the supply chain is referred to as the demand chain. Why? Because this is where the demand is coming from for your products. The demand is driven by the final customers. So it's coming from this side. So this part is referred to as the demand chain, and this part is referred to as the supply chain. Overall, if you're looking at it as a supply chain where value is being added, you can also refer to this whole thing as value chain. So again, different ways of looking at supply chain with different emphasis. Any questions here? You understand what demand chain means, what supply chain means, the difference between the two, and value chain. Those of you are online, any questions so far? Mariam, thank you for your feedback. I hope things are okay for others as well. Okay. All right. So we're going back on full screen again. Any questions, please use the raise hand. So what do we mean by supply chain management? What are we managing here now, right? So with supply chain management, like with many other operations management related decisions, here as well, we are looking at how to balance demand and supply, right? So we have been talking about that, I think, for almost all operations related decisions. It's all about matching demand and supply. But here we are trying to do that by going beyond our organization's limit. So we are not just looking at our company. We are trying to see, okay, how we can balance the demand and supply by coordinating activities with other companies as well. How can we coordinate those activities? Okay? So it's supply chain management. If you want to have a nice definition for it, it is strategic coordination of business functions within the business organization and throughout its supply chain. So within your company, all the functions within your company, and outside your company with your suppliers in your supply chain. Sure. And with the purpose of integrating supply and demand. So that's a quick definition. But again, what do we really mean by that? What do you actually do as part of supply chain management? So one of the things, these are some of the things that you would do as part of supply chain, managing a supply chain. And one of the key things that you would be looking at as part of, how your supply chain is going to be and, how complex it's going to be, it will depend on the level of outsourcing that you are going to have in your processes. What do we really mean by that again? So if you're Apple, I don't know if you know this, if your Apple did not manufacture their phones, if you look at the back of the phone, it says designed in Cupertino by Apple, but it's not manufactured by Apple. Right? Manufacturing is done by two. There are two main manufacturers for Apple. One of them is Foxconn. It's a manufacturer in China, and so Apple designs the phones, they provide specifications and so on, and then it's Foxconn who manufactures the phone for them. So similarly, and Foxconn has 300 plus suppliers which provide different parts and materials for them, and so on. So Apple has to make a decision. What should we manufacture the phone? They could have manufactured the phone. They could have gotten, but they wanted to focus on the software and the design, and that's where they are strong at. So this is what Apple does at the core, and then they outsource the manufacturing part of it. They may be outsourcing lots of other parts of aspects of their business to other companies. So this is, and that will determine how big and complex your supply chain is going to be. That is one of the key aspect that determines, how you're going to manage your supply chain and how complex your supply chain is going to be. And once you determine that, then of course, you have to procure the parts for it. So, which supplier should we get the parts from? Which other companies should we deal with? You have to make this decision. This is part of managing supply chain. Once you have that relationship, maintaining that relationship with the suppliers and managing that relationship. So usually it's not a buy-sell relationship. You have a much more longer-term relationship. So even if you might find other company that might be able to provide a particular part cheaper than the current supplier, you may stick with the current supplier because there may be other benefits that you might get from them, right? By having long-term relationship. So how do you manage those suppliers and their relationships? Managing the customer relationship. This is again looking at the demand side, right? Looking at your major customers and making sure that they get their products on time and whenever it's required. Your distributors and managing that relationship. That's part of supply chain management as well. And in general, looking at any logistics related problems and trying to respond to those problems quickly and effectively is also part of managing supply chain. So many companies, you probably heard about this, and when we had COVID and so on. Actually, even now with the rise in COVID in many parts of the world, many companies initially, they had to shut down the plant, and there was supply disruptions, and this was a big, you know, issue for many companies because they couldn't get the parts to continue their manufacturing, even if they were able to keep open in those parts of the world. So trying to address these problems and trying to, when you have these kind of issues, trying to be able to respond to them in an effective way, that's part of managing a supply chain as well. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but gives you some idea as to what you actually mean by managing a supply chain or supply chain management. Any questions here? Yeah. So you have some idea what do we really mean by managing a supply chain management? What are supply chains? Now, what are some of the things the companies are concerned today in relation to managing the supply chain or related to supply chain management? One key issue which been always been there is, there is a lot of investment that goes into when you get into managing supply chain, because you may have to have certain kind of information systems. Those information systems may need to be connected to their suppliers information systems, and there is a lot of investments that may be required for that. There may be investments required in logistics. There may be investments required in warehousing, and other processes that you might have in managing the relationship with your suppliers and so on. So, what is the return of those investments? When you make those investments, what is the actual benefit of it in terms of the dollar figures, in terms of the money that you're spending, how much value are you getting? That's still an issue in many companies, looking at the ROI, return on investment, that you might be making related to managing the supply chain. Because if you can't clearly show, what the return is on the investments are going to be, then you're not going to be able to get funds from management to make those changes. Another aspect that's happening, that's on the radar of companies today, is this what's called greening the supply chain, or in other words, how to make the supply chain much more sustainable, much more environmental friendly. Because customers are now requesting the products to be more environmentally friendly, and that translates into companies what they're doing as well, and they want their products to be more environmental friendly as well. So, and there's a lot of logistics involved. So there's how do you reduce the carbon footprint, and how to make the products more sustainable. These kind of issues. This is again something that many companies are looking at today. Um, Another aspect that many companies are reevaluating, especially in these days, is the level of outsourcing. So you might have, you know, uh, as Apple, as we mentioned before, they focus mostly on their software and the design of the product and so on. They might at some point, and they are huge companies, they until a couple of days back, their stock prices went so much up, and they were the first $3 trillion market capitalization company. So they have a lot of money. They could decide in the future, saying that, okay, now we are going to manufacture the products. We are going to get into manufacturing as well. So what level of outsourcing should they be having? So this is something that needs to be um, evaluated on a regular basis. So you might choose to outsource more, or you might choose to outsource less, but it's something that needs to be evaluated on a continuous basis. Information technology, integrating all kinds of different information technology. This is a big part of managing supply chain. As we mentioned, many a big part of the investment goes as information technology investments. Right? There's a lot of supply chain management, ERP systems, CRM systems, lots of new technologies coming up, making it easy to communicate with your suppliers and try to understand what the market trends are and so on. So that's a big part of what companies are looking at today. Managing risks, including the risks that we are facing these days with the COVID and economic risks, other economic risks. So trying to look at that. There may be political risks, for example, because your suppliers might be in some part of the world. If their operations gets disrupted, it may have an impact on your operation. So how do you manage those risks, and what are the risks? Trying to get a handle on that. That's something that companies are looking at today. We talked about lean last chapter 14, trying to implement lean within the company. But we also mentioned that if you really want to get the benefit of lean, then you have to go beyond your company's limits, and you have to look at how to implement lean with your suppliers as well, and implement just in time with your suppliers. So this is again something that a lot of companies are looking at, trying to implement lean principles and to become more agile, more flexible, in what they're trying to do. So again, some things that companies are that's in focus of companies today, some of the trends that's impacting companies from a supply chain point of view. Um, so if you look at the supply chain of most products today, you will see that it's much more globalized, because if you want to get a particular product, it's very likely, that company would have been getting parts from different parts of the world, or maybe being distributing those products to different parts of the world. So supply chains are much more global today than what used to be, and that brings much more complexity to managing supply chain. And these complexities can be because of the differences in people's language, culture in different parts of the world, and inability to understand that properly. It could be because of that. It could be because of currency fluctuations. So you probably noticed again, recently in Turkey and Lebanon, currency values are being, going up and down, very volatile, being very volatile these days. So if you're a company in Kuwait that is dealing with, uh, some company in Turkey, you have to look at these currency fluctuations, how it's going to impact the prices of the product, and your profitability and so on. So similarly, political instability is going to be an issue as well. Transportation costs, even though the transportation is becoming much more cheaper, as it as your supply chain becomes global, your transportation cost is going to increase because you have to ship things much more further, much more faster. So rather than sending it by shipping lines, you might have to ship it by airlines if you have to get it faster. So transportation costs, this is something that you need to keep a track of as well. And the lead times, of course, that goes along with it. Um, and another important element is the trust. How do you build trust with companies that's halfway across the world? How do you make sure that they will stand up to their promise? And one way to do that is to have these long-term relationships. Once you identify the right kind of supply chain suppliers for your company. So some of the things that you need to keep in mind as companies become, or supply chains become more global, companies start dealing with suppliers all across the globe, or companies all across the globe. Another aspect that's related to supply chain is the information technology, and major information technology that impacts supply chain management is ERP systems. So ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning Software. And many companies, this is one of the first things that they have to do before they even start managing their supply chain, or they even start thinking about managing the supply chain. They need to have a system that covers most of their internal business processes, and this is done by ERP systems. So a ERP system for AUM would be like the banner, because that's the main system that makes sure that students register for the right course, your official information is recorded properly there, you're graduating on time, and so on and so forth, which is the main process of AUM. Similarly, every company will have some kind of a system, an ERP system that will connect their major business processes. And most ERP systems today, they have components that you can activate, which coordinates things with your supplier, coordinates things with your customers. So CRM systems, supplier relationship management systems, performance management of the organization, right? How well the organization is doing on different metrics that you might set up, sales, order, and fulfillment. So these are all different components of supply chain management, and most ERP software today have um, components, modules that make this happen. So this is an important part of managing supply chain, making sure that you have the right information system. And finally, as you manage a supply chain, and today companies are paying more attention to this, the ethical aspect of managing the supply chain, because you might be a company that might have certain standards, and you might say, okay, we have certain practices that, best practices that we follow. But what about your suppliers? Your suppliers may be in China or Brazil or in India or some other part of the world. And are they paying attention to workers' rights? Are they, uh, using corruption or bribery to get things done? Um, uh, are you moving, outsourcing some part of your business manufacturing, for example, because it's not possible to do that manufacture that particular product because of environmental regulations or whatever in your country? So are you moving it because of that? So because if you're doing that, then it's just going to move the pollution to a different part of the world. You're still going to be polluting, um, uh, and whether you're exporting smokestacks, basically. So these are the kind of things that you need to pay attention, and a lot of companies are looking at that as well today. Um, and One way to do that is to make sure that as a global organization, you have some kind of an ethical supply chain code that you want your suppliers also to follow. So you can set standards, and you can say, and you can even see things like that in like if you're Nestle or some other company that's manufacturing chocolates, they say, we procure the cocoa from sustainable sources, or if you're using wood products or cotton from sustainable sources, if you're a clothing manufacturer. So a lot of companies are looking at that aspect. Uh, and it's good. It's good for the, you know if you get negative press from the things that your suppliers are doing, or uh, some part of your operation in other parts of the globe might be doing, then it's going to impact your sales. Customers are going to say, okay, this is a company that's not following ethical standards, and they might stop buying. And we have seen this happen with many large companies like Nike and many other companies. Um, So that's basically what we have in this chapter. I think that's the end of chapter 15. Just having a quick look at what is supply chain. What do we mean by supply chain management? What are some of the issues related to managing supply chain, right? And I hope you have some idea of that now. So, any questions on any of the things that we talked about? It's not a whole lot, okay. It's three chapters. Chapter 13 is the inventory management chapter. We have some problems from that chapter that you need to be familiar with, especially calculating the EOQ, economic ordering quantity, the different costs, the holding cost, ordering cost, total cost of carrying the inventory at reorder point. So there are some concepts there, and you should be familiar with those calculations. And other than that, it's mainly the big issues related to um, lean supply chain, and inventory that you're going to be tested on in the final assessment. All right. So, any questions, any comments? All good? Yeah. So, those of you are online,